Episode 1. You died already once. I saw it. They found her barefoot, standing at the edge of the cemetery just after sunrise. The girl, no older than 9, hair wet like she'd crawled out of the earth, asked to come for someone who didn't remember her name. Except, she did remember one thing, one sentence, and she said it to Father Lane before they even took her inside. You died already once. I saw it. That's when the birds stopped singing. No one in the parish knew where she came from. No parents. No missing child reports. Only a little girl in a white dress, whispering verses no one had taught her. And names. She whispered names. Of people who were long dead. Of priests buried beneath stone. Of children that never made it out of confession. Father Lane brought her into the rectory, wrapped her in a blanket, asked her what her name was. She smiled. They called me Claire, but he called me Witness. Who is her? He asked. She tilted her head. The one who let me remember. That night, she wouldn't sleep, wouldn't eat, wouldn't cry. She just sat her day by the chapel window, watching the altar, not the cross, the altar. And when Father Lane tried to bless her room with holy water, the candle near her flickered sideways. Against the wind, he asked her what she was watching for, and she whispered, without looking away, "He's waiting for you to lie again, at dawn." She walked into the sanctuary barefoot. The doors weren't open, but she walked in anyway. The nuns found her kneeling in front of the altar, eyes closed, hands folded, mouth moving, but not praying, repeating, like a courtroom stenographer for God. "You stole money from the collection plate," she said to Sister Catherine, without opening her eyes. "You buried the report about the choir boy," she said to Father Lane, calmly. "And you," she said to the crucifix itself. I suddenly wide, voice shaking. "You didn't stop any of it." They tried to remove her, but the chapel doors had locked themselves from the inside. And the altar, it had begun to bleed, thin lines of red running from the corners, down the steps, across the floor, forming a circle around the girl. She looked up. Her eyes were no longer brown. They were the color of smoke after judgment. She whispered to no one, "I remember what the fire looked like. I remember the screams that never ended. And I remember you were there too." Then she looked at Father Lane and asked, "Do you want me to tell them what you saw right before you burned?" That was the moment he collapsed, not from illness, from recognition, because no one had ever told her how he almost died during the fire at St. Benedict's. But she knew. She remembered all of it, because Claire wasn't here to be saved. She was here to remind them all what judgment really looks like. Episode 2. She knew the sins of everyone in the church. She wasn't baptized, not in water, not in any name the church would accept, but somehow she knew things no child should, things that made pews empty, that made holy men tremble, things that should have died in confessional silence, but didn't. The morning after she arrived, Father Lane called an emergency meeting in the sacristy. 6 priests, 3 nuns, and the girl, Claire, sitting silently in the back, folding pages from a hymnal into perfect little crosses. "She's disturbed," one of them said. "Possessed," muttered another. "It's a trick," hissed a third. Someone coached her. Then Claire spoke, still folding, still smiling. "You slept with Sister Agnes the night before your ordination. Father Miguel, he went pale. And you, Sister Therese, you prayed he wouldn't regret it." The crosses in her hands began to drip red. They tried to remove her again. This time, Father Thomas took her by the arm. That's when the paintings in the hall began to fall, one by one, as if struck by an invisible judgment. The last to hit the ground, the portrait of Bishop Lauren, burned at the edges, and behind it, scrawled in faint soot, he knew about the basement. That night, the girl walked into the sanctuary once more. Alone, unafraid, she moved to the pulpit, stood on her toes, and whispered a sermon no one had written. And the statues listened. You could hear them, the groaning of marble, the cracking of eyelids sealed shut for a century. By morning, the Virgin statue was crying, not tears, ash. And Claire, she stood beside it, wiping the ash with the sleeve of her nightgown, humming a melody no one recognized, but all felt. The real terror began on Sunday. The pews were full. Word had spread of the prophetic girl. Some came to witness a miracle. Others came to expose a fraud. Claire entered from the side aisle, barefoot again, her feet stained red with wax and blood from the broken candles she had walked over. She moved to the altar and stared at each person in the front row. "You hate your wife," she said softly to a deacon. "You lied about the fire," she said to the bishop. "You prayed for your daughter to die," she said to the woman in the third pew. There was no scream, no thunder, just shaking, like the soul of the church was trying to climb out of his skin. Then she spoke to everyone. "You built this house on silence. You decorated it with shame, and you sing psalms to a God you hope doesn't remember." Her voice didn't rise, but her words did. They rose like incense that stoned the throat instead of blessing it. "But I remember," she whispered, "because I've already been judged, and I came back with the list." Outside, the bells rang. No one had touched them, and the crucifix above the altar, it was smiling. Episode 3. She said hell is colder than heaven ever was. They expected her to speak of fire, to describe hell as flame and screams and endless burning. But Claire just stared at them from the front pew, hands folded neatly in her lap. "I'd said hell is colder than heaven ever was," and everyone listening felt it. The temperature dropped after she spoke. You could see it in the breath of the choir boys. You could feel it in the marble beneath your feet. The stained glass windows fogged over from the inside, and for the first time in 37 years, the sanctuary candles refused to stay lit. Sister Miriam tried 3 times. Each time, the flame snuffed itself out the moment Claire looked at it. After the service, the bishop approached her with a velvet smile and a silver crucifix. He knelt beside her and asked, "Child, do you know where you came from?" She tilted her head. "You called it judgment. I called it remembering." He frowned. "Remembering what?" "A cold." The silence. The moment heaven turned its face away. That night, she wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, wouldn't pray, just Saturday in the chapel, staring at the crucifix. At 2:03 a.m., the church organ played by itself. 3 notes, over and over. Not a.m. A warning. The nuns rushed in, but Claire was gone. Only her footprints remained, tiny, bare, leading down into the crypts beneath the church, where no child should go, where no one had gone since the fire. They found her standing before the sealed gate of the lower sanctum, her eyes closed, her mouth moving, but silent. They called her name, no answer, until she finally turned and said, "You buried them too deep, but the cold remembers, and now they're waking up." Father Lane stepped forward. "Oh, Claire, who's waking up?" She looked straight at him and smiled with that warmth. "The ones who burned for sins they never confessed, and they remember yours." By morning, frost had bloomed across the church walls, not from the outside in, from beneath. Scriptures etched in the ice and names, dates, phrases long erased from parish records. "Forgive me, Father. It wasn't my fault. I never meant to die." That day, half the clergy fled. The other half locked themselves in the sacristy with relics they barely believed in anymore. And Claire, she stood in the pulpit, arms outstretched as if crucified by memory alone, and whispered to no one. The ones in heaven forget to listen, but hell hears everything. And when she exhaled, you could see the frost leave her mouth. Episode 4. The confession box was empty, but it answered. It was supposed to be sacred. The confession box, a place where sins were whispered, never echoed, where forgiveness was offered without a face, where the veil between man and God was meant to protect, not haunt. But that morning, the booth spoke first, and no one had entered. Father Lane was the first to hear it. He was walking past the back of the chapel, palms cold, rosary swinging between trembling fingers, when a voice whispered from behind the lattice, "Forgive me, Father, I didn't mean to leave her there." He frowned. See, the booth was locked, empty, and the voice, it belonged to a man who died 5 years ago, Father Marcus, buried in the parish graveyard with his secrets sealed in cedar. But his guilt had stayed buried. By noon, more voices followed, each whispered sin more chilling than the last. "I took the child from the orphanage, and no one asked why. I watched him drown and told the others it was fate. I kissed the cross and cursed him in the same breath." None of the voices belonged to anyone living. None of them had a mouth nearby. But the box, it remembered. It had held too many secrets for too long. That evening, Sister Miriam found Claire sitting inside the booth. Smiling, eyes closed, she had entered from the front. The doors were sealed, but she was there, rocking gently, as if cradling something far too heavy for her size. Miriam stepped closer, clutching her rosary like a blade. "What are you doing in there, child?" Claire opened her eyes. They were pitch black, still, calm, eternal. "Listening to who?" Claire pressed her tiny hand against the wooden wall between them. "The lattice bled, to the ones you made silent." The next morning, the booth was gone, not removed, vanished. In its place was a hole in the floor, not deep, but endless. A soft wind rose from it, whispering names no one had spoken in decades. Names of altar boys, of forgotten nuns, of mothers who cried in the third pew, week after week, until their faces became part of the stone. Claire stood beside the hole, watching. "They used to scream," she said. "Now they confess to the dark." "Is that hell?" someone asked. She shook her head. "No, hell listens. This is where heaven leaves the voiceless." And then the church bells rang, but the ropes were untouched. The tower was empty. Only one thing moved inside the chapel, the crucifix above the altar. It had turned upside down, and from its carved wooden lips came a breath. Episode 5. She said the dead don't want justice if they want witnesses. She Saturday on the church steps as if nothing inside was wrong. Hair in braids, fingers locked in prayer, a child's posture, a prophet's stillness. They came to her like pilgrims now, not to bless her, to beg, not for mercy, but for understanding. Because by now, they knew Claire wasn't a warning, she was a mirror. An old woman approached, shaking, wrinkled, whispering, "I confessed it already. I did. 40 years ago." Claire didn't open her eyes. She just spoke, softly, clearly, like a page turning in the dark. "You confessed to a man who buried your words behind stained glass and silver lies. You said it, but no one listened. And the dead don't want justice. They want someone to remember." The woman broke down sobbing at her feet. And Claire, she just looked up at the sky and whispered, "One down." That night, the chapel smelled of old earth and burnt pages. Someone or something had reopened the archives beneath the altar, the vault that had been sealed since the fire. Inside, they found charred confession logs, half-written letters, ripped tapes, but one thing was untouched, a wooden box, nailed shut with 7 rusted spikes. Claire was already standing beside it, waiting. "Is that yours?" Father Lane asked. She nodded. "It's not mine because I wrote it. It's mine because I watched them write it, and they hoped no one would ever read it again." The bishop arrived by midnight, stern, pale, surrounded by men in black. He asked for the box to be burned. Claire didn't move. "If you burn this box," she said, "the ground will open beneath your feet." He called her bluff, ordered the fire lit, but the moment flame touched wood, every candle in the sanctuary exploded, and the crucifix above the altar wept. Real tears, black as ink. The flame died. The box remained, and carved across its lid, newly revealed by soot. They remembered too late. At dawn, Claire walked to the center of the chapel, where pews had cracked, where the pulpit had crumbled, where the whispers never stopped. She stood where sermons had once rotted in air, and she spoke. They never wanted punishment, only memory. They wanted someone to say, I saw what they did to you," because the greatest sin was acting like it never happened. She turned toward the door, toward the people outside, watching from behind caution tape and crucifixes they no longer trusted. You think judgment comes with fire, but sometimes it comes with witnesses. And I am not the judge. I am the one who never looked away. Though inhaled, the bells rang backward. The floor cracked beneath the box, and the ground breathed. Not a quake, a testimony. Episode 6. The ground opened, but it wasn't hell underneath. It didn't roar when the floor cracked. It sighed, like something buried for too long had finally been given permission to breathe. The stone beneath the altar split clean down the center, revealing not fire, but stairs, old, uneven, wet with something too red to be water. And Claire, she didn't hesitate. She walked toward the hole like she'd been waiting years to return. Father Lane called out, but his voice felt smaller down there. Muted, he reached for her arm, but stopped, because the air that rose from the stairwell wasn't hot. It was cold, familiar, holy, wrong. It smelled like every funeral he'd ever officiated, every secret he'd swallowed in the confessional, every moment of silence that was never truly silent. Claire turned back just once and said, "You buried it under God's name. That doesn't make it sacred." The stairs led not to a crypt, not to hell, not to anything they taught in seminary. They led to a room that should not exist. The original chapel, burned, boarded, forgotten, the place they built over. And in the center of that forgotten room, another altar, but this one wasn't made of stone. It was made of names, thousands of them, etched into bone whitewood, some faded, some fresh, some still bleeding. Claire approached the altar and placed her hand on its surface. Instantly, the candles relit themselves, not above, below, flickering flames in the cracks of the floor, each one casting shadows that didn't move like they should. She looked up, eyes dim as unspoken prayers. This is where they buried the first voice, not a body, a voice, the one who spoke too much, the one who remembered what heaven tried to unwrite. Sister Miriam, trembling at the top of the stairs, finally stepped into the room. "Claire, what is this place?" Claire smiled gently. "Not hell. Hell is honest. This is where they hide the liars." The walls pulsed, not metaphorically, physically, like they were lungs, still full of breath from centuries ago. And, they began to speak. Whispers rose from the stone, layered, cracked, broken. A woman sobbing, "I told the priest," and he locked the door. A man choking on guilt. "They said she'd gone mad, but I knew. A child's voice, barely a breath. I said no." He prayed louder. Father Lane fell to his knees, because he recognized one of the voices. His own, not from today, not even from adulthood, but from when he was a boy, telling the truth, and being told to forget it. Claire stood over him now, not as a child, as a memory made flesh. "You weren't the only one who spoke. You were just the only one they taught to silence himself." And then the altar, the one made of names, opened, not a door, a mouth, breathing out the final line of the forgotten gospel. "We were never trying to haunt you. We were just waiting for someone to listen." Episode 7. The altar was never built to worship, only to cover what still breathed. Altars are supposed to be sacred, but this one wasn't built to lift prayers. It was built to trap something that still moved beneath it, something that hadn't died, only been forgotten. The room groaned around us, like the walls were tired of being quiet. The altar of names, Saturday wide open now, its interior dark and pulsing like a slow-beating heart. Inside, no relics, no scriptures, just breath, rising, falling, as if something inside the altar was dreaming. And Claire, she stood at the edge of the opening and whispered. It was never a table, it was a lid. Father Lane, still on his knees, stared at her like she had torn history in half. "What's inside it, Claire?" She looked at him, not like a child, like a witness from before language, a voice that couldn't be silenced, a scream they turned into stone, a memory too loud for heaven. The flames in the cracks dimmed, the ground stilled, and it spoke. The voice wasn't male, wasn't female, wasn't even human. It sounded like every prayer that ended in silence, every plea that was answered with, "We'll speak of this no more." It said, "You sealed me in worship. You masked me with rituals. You dressed my cage in gold and incense and called it holy. But I remember what you buried beneath your amen." Claire stepped into the mouth of the altar, not afraid, invited. The walls didn't shake. They inhaled. And when she reached the center, she found it. Not a corpse, not a demon, a book, alive. Its cover was flesh. Its pages turned on their own, and each verse written inside bled a little as it moved. She opened it, and the room fell silent. No more breathing, no more moaning walls, only Claire's voice, reading. This is the part of the gospel they never taught, where the betrayed were never avenged, where the choir of the damned sang to each other not to be heard, but to not feel alone. She turned the page, and the book whispered back, "Do not worship what silenced you. Remember it." Suddenly, every candle in the chapel above blew out. Every statue turned its head. Every crucifix cracked, not down the middle, across the mouth, as if heaven itself could no longer pretend it wasn't listening. Claire walked back out of the altar, book in hand, eyes glowing. "They told you to kneel here," she said, pointing to the altar. "But this was never meant for praise. It was meant to weigh you down, to hold the scream that didn't feed in sermons." She looked up at Father Lane, then the bishop, then the sky. "You build a temple over a buried voice, but now it remembers how to speak." Episode 8. Every church is built over something they didn't want to face. They say churches are sanctuaries, places of shelter, of grace, but Claire stood at the center of St. Elora's chapel with a book of breathing pages in her hands and whispered a truth the walls had been aching to release. Every church is built over something they didn't want to face. By morning, word had spread that the altar had split open, that Claire had walked into its mouth and returned with a book that wrote itself. The bishop demanded the building be sealed, said it was structurally unsound, unholy, but the truth was harder to hold. The church was never holy to begin with. It had only been quiet. That day, the congregation gathered outside, unable to enter, not because the doors were locked, because the air had turned honest. And honesty is unbearable when it comes from the mouths you silenced. Every time someone stepped closer to the chapel door, they heard it, their own sin, repeated back in their own voice, spoken by no one. A woman fell to her knees, clutching her ears. "I left her crying in the pew. I told her to forget. I told her it was her fault." An old priest screamed. He said he didn't want to go back into the confessional. "I made him go anyway." One by one, they stepped back, because some people don't want salvation. They want denial. Inside, Claire placed the book on the pulpit. The pages flapped open like wings. From the torn spine, a voice rose. This one wasn't cold. It was human, pained. "When I screamed, they gave me scripture. When I wept, they gave me silence. When I remembered, they called it sin." Claire didn't cry. She just whispered, "I didn't come to forgive. I came to uncover." Father Lane entered at dusk. That chapel was dark, but the altar glowed, lit from beneath, like it was remembering the fire they tried to forget. He found Claire kneeling, not praying, listening. The book beside her was open to a blank page. She turned to him. "There's one more story at once." He swallowed. "Ours." She touched his chest, over his heart. "Yours. The time you said nothing, when silence was a choice." He broke, collapsed at the altar like a man who had just remembered he had a soul. The crucifix above them flickered with shadow. Not evil, exposure, as if the figure hanging there had finally opened its eyes and couldn't look away. Claire rose. She placed her hand on the altar's edge, and from deep beneath the chapel, something shifted, not approaching, awakening. The earth trembled, the floor cracked again, and from the foundation came a final warning. If they keep building over the scream, then one day the scream will build its own altar. Episode 9. The chapel never burned. It was buried alive. They always said the fire destroyed it, that the original chapel of St. Elora's was consumed in holy flame during the storm of 66, that it collapsed under judgment, cleansed by heaven's fury. But Claire stood beneath the rebuilt sanctuary, one hand on the cracked earth, and the other holding a book that still bled, and whispered what the walls had never been allowed to say. The chapel never burned. It was buried alive. The ground beneath her feet wasn't ash. It was choked prayer, compressed beneath decades of marble and lies. Every step deeper into the sub-foundation pulsed like a heartbeat. Not hers, not human. Father Lane followed her down the narrow stone corridor, sweat cold on his collar, rosary tight in his fist. "What's down here?" Claire hissed, his voice trembling. She didn't answer with words. She pointed, and there, half swallowed by the dirt, was a door, wooden, carved, blackened by something older than fire. There was no handle, only a phrase etched in the center, scorched into the grain. "Let no truth rise from this place." Claire knelt before it. She placed the book beside her and pressed her small palm against the door. The symbols lit up, not with flame, with memory. Father Lane stepped back, because he'd seen that door before. He was 12, acolyte, curious. The night before the storm, he'd wondered where he wasn't meant to go, and he'd heard it, the voices, whispering from beneath the altar, not in Latin, not in tongues, in names, names of those who vanished, those who confessed and were never seen again. those who had become too inconvenient for redemption. And the priests, they sealed it, poured oil over the hinges, called it sacrifice, buried the truth with bricks, hymns, and sermons. But truth is not ash. It doesn't burn. It waits. Claire stood, her eyes now glowing faintly gold, like candlelight trapped in a storm. They didn't lock it because of what was inside. She said they locked it because it knew what they did. And with that, the door opened. Inside wasn't a room. It was a mirror, not of glass, of sound. The air was filled with every confession that was ever ignored, every breath before a scream, every sob that ended in silence. The chamber wasn't empty. It was echoing. Claire stepped in, barefoot. She didn't flinch. She didn't tremble. She belonged. The chamber recognized her. They buried the chapel because it spoke. She said they thought no one would return to listen. She placed the book on the stone floor. It opened one final time to a page with no ink, only heat, and the altar above back in the sanctuary beckoned to shake, not collapse, rise, as if something below. It was finally waking up after decades of silence. Claire looked back at Father Lane. Her voice was soft but undeniable. You didn't survive the fire. You survived the forgetting. Episode 10. God wasn't the first to abandon this place. Everyone always asks the same question. Where was God when it happened? But Claire sat cross-legged on the chapel floor, her small hands pressed against the trembling altar, her voice low enough to make the walls lean in, and she answered what no pulpit ever dared. God wasn't the first to abandon this place. The sanctuary was crumbling, not falling apart, shedding like old skin peeling off something that had been pretending to be holy for too long. The gold trim along the crucifix had turned black. The marble beneath the pews pulsed, like something breathing beneath it. The stained glass windows no longer showed saints. They showed witnesses, mouths sewn shut. As wide open, Father Lane stood in the center of the church, his cassock soaked in sweat and dust, his rosary broken at his feet. He stared at Claire like a man seeing fire take its first breath. If not God, then who left first? Claire looked at him with something deeper than pity. The ones who swore to protect it, the ones who saw what they weren't supposed to, and chose silence instead of light. They left before God ever could. Beneath them, the original chapel groaned. The buried altar, the living book, all of it was stirring, not with rage, not even with grief, with hunger, not for flesh, for witnesses, for someone who wouldn't walk away this time. The congregation had returned. Not the faithful, the forgotten. They stood in the corners of the chapel, pale figures with no breath, no shadow. Their eyes glowed faintly, not accusing, inviting, and Claire stood among them. She opened the book again, its pages glowing now with names that had never been written down. She read aloud. He saw the bruises and called them imagination. She heard the cry in the sacristy and told herself it was wind. They buried the girl under the floor and replaced her with silence. Then, a pause, a breath so still the air cracked, and she whispered, and heaven turned away, because it was easier. The crucifix above the altar trembled, then sapped. Christ's body fell, not forward, backward, as if even that symbol had grown tired of watching. The ground opened once more beneath the altar, not jagged, clean, like a door being held open by something that never forgot. Claire approached it. The dead stepped aside, and she said to no, or maybe to everything. Heaven will not save this church, because this church taught heaven how to forget. And then she stepped into the light rising from beneath the altar. Not white, not gold, memory-colored. It pulsed with every scream that never echoed. And for the first time in the house of silence, something holy knelt. Episode 11. The voice under the altar never stopped speaking. We just stopped hearing it. Some said the voice beneath the altar was a curse. Others called it a relic, a leftover scream stitched into the bones of the chapel. But Claire knew the truth. It was never the voice that disappeared. It was us. We just stopped listening. The light rising from the ground wasn't warm. It was honest. Each ray shimmered with sound. Not music, not language, but confession. Unwritten, unspoken, unburied. Father Lane stood near the altar, face lit by truths he never wanted to see again. A choir of silence surrounded him. Then, the voice spoke, again, not through Claire, through the stones, through the air. Do you remember how loud we were before you taught us to disappear? The pews groaned. Dust rose like breath. We were never ghosts. You made us that way. Claire lifted the book of the forgotten and walked to the altar. Its pages flipped on their own, like when guided by memory. She didn't have to read anymore. Now a reader, and from her mouth came a sound not of this world, not a scream, not a psalm, a memory ray spoken. The walls trembled. The statues wept black. The crucifix, already fallen, burned it in flame. But in voice, the church's foundation began to pulse, not crumble. Wake, from the deepest chamber below, the voice grew louder, no longer whispers. Names, each syllable cracked like thunder. Marcia, Thomas, Luca, Watkin, Elena, Father Lane. His head snapped up. No, he whispered, trembling. I didn't. You didn't stop it. Claire replied. You wore robes and washed hands, but your silence baptized their pain. He collapsed. He didn't cry. He listened. The altar opened fully, now a mouth wide with memory, and rising from it, not bodies, not demons, but stories. Every silence ever sealed beneath holy stone took form. A girl sobbing in a confessional, a boy with bruises and a secret, a woman who begged the Virgin for help and was answered with echoes. They were not specters. They were evidence. Claire turned to the congregation, not the living, but the remembered. You were told you needed forgiveness, but the only sin was that no one stayed to hear you. She placed the book inside the altar. Its glow turned crimson, and in one unified breath, the dead whispered, It's not judgment we want. It's the right to be known. Outside, bells began to ring. No one touched them. They rang backward, as if time itself had decided to testify. And inside, the walls began to whisper in a language older than Scripture. Truth, raw, undeniable, unlitigated. Claire knelt by the altar, not to pray, to listen, and from beneath her, the final phrase rose like a vow. We were never quiet. You just built cathedrals over our cries. Episode 12. She was not the prophet. She was the echo you couldn't kill. Claire was never chosen. She was left behind, not by accident, by design. The church forgot her, but the altar remembered. And when it opened, it did not anoint her as a prophet. It unveiled her as the one thing they couldn't silence. The echo that bounced off the marble lies, that seeped into hymnals and refused to die inside them. The congregation living and dead stood still. Even the sky above the chapel refused to move. Clouds hovered, wind held its breath, and the moon full and watching seemed to bleed light into the stained glass, revealing scenes never commissioned. A priest turning his back, a child gripping a rosary too tightly, a woman burying her own voice beneath folded hands. Claire stood at the altar, barefoot and unwavering. The book of the forgotten had closed, but it pulsed, alive, like it was breathing through her. And, turn, she spoke, but not with her voice, with every voice that never got to speak. It wasn't loud. It was final. You buried us in God's house and thought it made the ground sacred. But holiness doesn't bloom from silence. It demands reckoning. Father Lane had nothing left to say. He knelt not in worship, but in surrender. The walls cracked, not from collapse, from release. The entire chapel began to lift, literally rise, stone by stone, pew by pew, as if the foundation no longer needed to hold it down. Beneath it, a pit opened, but not to hell, to everything they buried. Voices, names, histories, unwritten psalms screamed into pillows. Confessions shouted to deaf ears. Claire looked into the pit and whispered one final truth. You didn't build this place to save souls. You built it to keep the screaming out of heaven. And, turn, as if on cue, the sky cracked. Not thunder, sound, the sound of remembering. Every church bell in the valley began to ring. Every crucifix trembled. Every pew across the country leaned forward. Because truth was no longer waiting for permission, Claire turned toward the last closed door, the sacristy, and said, They're not done speaking. She opened it, and inside wasn't a room. It was a storm. Episode 13, finale. The storm didn't come to destroy the church. It came to finish what silence started. The door swung open, but it wasn't a room behind it. Not walls, not relics, not sacred cloth. It was weather. A storm that had no wind, no thunder, only memory. Claire stepped through it, not consumed, not erased, claimed. Behind her, the chapel trembled, not as a victim, but as a thing finally asked to remember what it had protected. The crucifix, long fallen, now floated above the altar, not as a symbol of redemption, but of reckoning. The floor beneath the book of the forgotten cracked open fully, revealing not fire, but thousands of eyes, watching, waiting, witnesses to every name never written, to every child told their pain was blasphemy. Claire stood in the center of the eye of the storm, and she did not scream. She listened, and what she heard were not curses, not damnations, but stories, millions of them, each one left out of the gospel, because it made the congregation shift in their seats, because it sounded too much like truth. The church began to rise, not heavenward, but away from the lie it was built upon. Its marble peeled into ash, its stained glass reversed its colors. The saints wept, not blood, but ink, the kind never used to write down what mattered most. Then the storm spoke, all around her, inside her, through her. It said, "We were never the enemy, we were the consequence. You mistook silence for safety. You built sanctuaries on top of our graves. Now, we will finish what your prayers were too afraid to touch." Claire turned to Father Lane. He knelt beneath the altar. Shake him. She knelt beside him. "They don't want revenge," she whispered. "They want their names spoken out loud." Once, he opened his mouth, and for the first time in his priesthood, he said nothing holy. He just said, "I remember you, Elena." And the storm paused. A wind moved through the chapel. It didn't destroy, it rewrote. Every wall whispered a name. Every pew recited a memory. Every brick let go of what it once held like a secret. And, turned, as if history exhaled. The church was gone, not shattered. Lifted, the ground was bare, the sky open, and standing in the middle was only Claire, alone, not empty, full of every voice that would never be lost again. She knelt, one last time, and from the soil, a single flower bloomed, its petals red like scripture, its stem trembling with breath. She placed the book of the forgotten into the dirt beside it, closed, and whispered, "You remember now. You come rest." Season 2, Episode 1. She knew the sins of everyone in the church. No one told her. No one whispered it in her ear. No name slipped on a piece of paper. But when Claire stepped inside that new church, clean walls, perfect pews, like that smelled of money, she knew everything. Not their names, their sins. The bishop smiled at her, too wide, too rehearsed. His gold cross sparkled like it still believed in its own reflection. "You're the girl from the valley, aren't you?" he asked. Claire nodded. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because while he was smiling, she was already seeing it. The girl, the stairwell, the way his cassock never had wrinkles. "We've heard rumors of miracles. That you can feel what others can't." He paused. "Or that you remember things that never happened." Claire looked into his eyes, and the smile flickered, because somewhere inside, he heard it too, his own voice, from 27 years ago, begging someone to just forget. The other priest stayed back. One held a hymnal upside down. Another adjusted his collar 3 times in 60 seconds. The youngest one wouldn't look at her at all. Claire walked the aisle, one slow step after another, and with every footfall, it was like the walls listened. The stained glass didn't glow. It winced. The statues turned slightly, not toward God, toward her. She stopped at the altar. She didn't kneel. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a single white match. No box, no lighter, just the match. She set it gently on the altar cloth, and the cloth shivered. Then she whispered, but not to anyone, to the building, to the memory trapped in the bricks. "This church is not empty. It's full of things you prayed would stay dead." The bishop's hands clenched. "There is nothing here to fear." He snapped. "You were brought to be blessed, not to threaten." Claire finally looked at him, just once, and he fell silent, because on her face was no anger, no judgment, only recognition. "I didn't come to threaten you," she said. "I came to remind you." She turned. The door slammed shut behind her. No wind, just memory. And as she walked back down the aisle, past frowning faces and twitching eyes, The match on the altar lit itself, not in fire, in light, white, silent, blinding, and from the flames came a voice no one uttered since the night a girl disappeared behind the sacristy door. You buried me in this place, but the altar remembers my name. Episode 2. The pews whispered when no one Saturday on them. It started the night Claire left the match. The fire didn't spread. It didn't scorch or consume. It remembered. And the next morning, when the bishop returned to the chapel, he found the pews breathing, not creaking, breathing. Every wooden bench curved slightly inward, like it was holding the weight of someone who'd never gotten up. At first, he blamed exhaustion, said the floor must be warped. But then he heard it, a sound so soft, so familiar. Why didn't you open the door? It wasn't shouted, it was whispered from the second row, then the fourth, then the seventh, always the seventh. He stood frowning, eyes wide, ears aching to you and hear it, but the pews weren't done. I knocked, I screamed, you passed by me, you never came back. He stumbled out of the chapel and called the youngest priest, Father Mateo, 27 years old, clean hands, trembling voice. Did you hear anything? The bishop asked. Mateo hesitated. His eyes were red. The pew I Saturday on, it said my mother's name, and then it asked if I forgave you. The bishop told everyone to take a day of silence. No sermons, no masses, no entry, but the church didn't need entry. That night, the pews began to move, only slightly an inch here, a whisper there, but enough that when the sacristan entered the chapel in the dark, he found the benches rearranged, not at random, into the shape of a circle, with one pew in the center, like a trail. Claire, miles away, woke up with dust on her palms, not from her bed, from wood, and she whispered, "They're not haunting the church. They're returning to their seats." Back inside the chapel, Mateo returned the next morning. Against orders, he stepped into the aisle and the door shut behind him, but he didn't panic, because he heard the whisper, too. But this time it didn't accuse. It asked, "Will you be the first to stay?" He Saturday, second row, left side, and nothing hurt him, but everything spoke. The wood beneath him warned, then wept, and the voice returned. "We prayed here too. We believed too. You thought silence meant we were gone, but the altar knows how to wait." In the rectory, the bishop saw the candles light themselves. He dropped to his knees, not in prayer, in fear, because he knew what the pews were doing, rebuilding a congregation. But this time, not one that forgot. Episode 3. The confessional whispered her name before anyone said it. The confessional had been locked for years, a relic, too narrow for comfort, too dark for aesthetics, too full of memory to be useful. The priest used the new booth, now glass-paneled, softly lit, discreet. But that morning, when Father Mateo stepped into the sanctuary, he heard it, the wooden one, the ancient one, breathing. He stopped mid-aisle. The pews were quiet, now watchful, as if waiting for what came next. And from the corner, behind the curtain and the carved wood, a whisper slid through the air like a knife under cloth. "Claire," just one word, but it felt like a summons. Mateo turned toward it, lips trembling. No one else was in the church, yet the confessional had spoken a name he hadn't even dared to say aloud. When he pulled the curtain aside, the air grew thick, the kind of thick you feel in basements or graves, the kind you don't breathe because it remembers too much. He stepped in, Saturday, and before he could say a word, a voice old and small and young to be old whispered, "I never wanted him punished. I just wanted to be heard." The breath caught in his throat. He tried to reply, but the words curled back into his chest. Then the confessional trembled violently, just enough to echo. He said, "I wasn't worthy of heaven unless I stayed silent. So I did, and I died inside this box." Mateo's tears came fast, not from guilt, from recognition. He remembered the rumor from seminary, the story they weren't supposed to tell, the little girl who vanished after confession. Her name had been forgotten, intentionally, repeatedly, but the booth hadn't. He remembered her like a promise. Back in the rectory, the bishop lit candle after candle, trying to push the shadows out of the room, but the light wouldn't spread. It pooled, like it was afraid of the walls. And just before he stepped out, he heard a whisper behind him, not from the hallway, from his own coat. "She's not here to accuse. She's here to finish what the church started and never dared complete. Mateo emerged from the booth pale and silent. The congregation was arriving, but they were quiet too. They didn't greet one another, didn't genuflect, didn't smile, because they all felt it now. The church wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a courtroom built from bones and breath, and every sacred object. A witness. Claire stood outside the gate, watching, not with anger, with certainty. She whispered to herself, they still think they need to confess, but what they really need is to listen. Episode 4. The crucifix turned its face when she walked in. They didn't notice at first. The congregation had gathered in whispers, hands folded out of habit, not faith. The air was colder now, even in summer. But when Claire stepped through the chapel doors, the entire room seemed to flinch. Not from fear, from recognition, and above the altar, the crucifix, a tall, solemn carving of Christ, moved just a tilt, barely a breath. But his face, once staring down over the pews like a shepherd in sorrow, turned away from the altar, away from the people. Poor Claire. Gasps rippled through the sanctuary. One woman fainted. A child began to cry. But Claire didn't blink. She just walked the center aisle like she'd been here before. Because she had, not in body, in memory, in the walls, in the silence that this church used to bury the screams. Father Mateo stood at the pulpit, hands shaking. He had prepared a homily, written every word, but it died in his throat when Claire looked at him. Because when she looked, she saw the night he saw something in the back pew and chose to look away. And he knew she had not come for revenge. She had come to finish the story. The crucifix groaned again, louder now, with bending without breaking, not toward her, away from the altar, as if even the image of God could no longer bear the weight of what had happened beneath it. Claire stepped up to the chancel rail. She didn't touch it, but every candle lining the walls went out. No wind, no end, only truth. And in that sacred dark, her voice rose and loud, but undeniable. He turned his face, not because he abandoned you, but because he refused to watch this place lie one more time. Someone tried to sing a hymn. It died halfway through the first note. The organ let out a groan, like something was stuck in its pipes, or screaming through them. And above them all, the crucifix tilted further. Christ was no longer looking at the people. He was looking toward the confessional, where her name had been spoken, where silence had been swallowed like wine. Claire turned. Behind her, the crowd didn't move, couldn't. They weren't trapped. They were being asked to stay, to listen, to finally hear the church speak not from doctrine, but from debt. And from the farthest pew, a man rose. He didn't look at her. He looked down, and he said, voice shaking, I saw her crying in that box. I told myself it wasn't my place. Claire nodded once. You remember her now. That's where judgment begins. And outside, for the first time in decades, it rained, not with water, but ashes, from all the names the church burned to keep holy. Episode 5. The Bible in the pulpit was missing pages, and she remembered everyone. The church had always displayed its Bible like a trophy, open on the pulpit, bound in cracked red leather, its edges gold-leafed and reverent. But this morning, as the sun failed to reach the altar, something was wrong. Father Mateo was the first to see it. He opened the book, preparing to read the passage for the day, and his fingers sank into emptiness. Whole pages were gone, torn out with a blade, not a hand. Precision, not panic. Down scenes missing, some from Genesis, many from Revelation, and one from the Gospel of Matthew. One about the children. He turned pale, looked around. The sanctuary was still. Even the candles didn't flicker. Then he looked up and saw Claire already watching him. She didn't look angry. She looked like she was waiting. He whispered toward her, barely audible, do you know what was written there? Claire nodded. Once. And then, she did something no one had done in that church for 50 years. She stepped up to the pulpit and read aloud, not from a book, not from memory, from something older than ink, something carried in her blood since the day they tried to silence her. Blessed are the forgotten, for their names are carved in places too sacred for hands to hold. Woe to the house that locks its doors from within and calls it sanctuary. You build your gospel on bones, and you dare call it holy. The room didn't move, but the walls listened. and from inside the pulpit, a sound rose, the soft crackle of flame, but without heat. Pages, the missing pages, they were returning, but not as paper, as whispers, thousands of voices murmuring in unison. Children, mothers, forgotten parishioners, the names that had no tombstones, the verses they were told to forget, the testimonies torn from holy books because they weren't convenient. And, turn, the book itself bled, not blood, ink, from the spine, from between the gilded pages, black, eternal, unstoppable. The bishop rushed forward, panicked, tried to close it, tried to hide the pulpit behind a veil, but Claire turned toward him and said only this: "If God wanted their silence, He would not have written them into me." And at that moment, the ink pulled down the pulpit and spelled out for words. I remember for them, no one clapped, no one prayed, but the people didn't leave. They stayed, because for the first time in decades, the word was alive again, and it no longer belonged to the priests. Episode 6, they tried to exorcise her, but the spirit didn't leave. He laughed. They didn't ask Claire, they summoned her. The bishop called it a spiritual intervention. The Vatican called it a precautionary rite, but everyone else knew exactly what it was. An exorcism. Claire didn't scream when they tied her to the chair. She didn't flinch when the priest splashed holy water over her forehead. She only blinked slowly, as if watching something too ancient to fear anymore. Father Lucien, the exorcist, stepped forward. He had salt in one hand and scripture in the other. "Tell us your name," he demanded. Claire's eyes stayed calm, and then she whispered, "You already erased it once. Why would I give it back?" They began the rite. Chants in Latin, crosses pressed to her skin, a relic from some forgotten saint held inches from her chest. The room flickered, candles dimmed, shadows stretched, the temperature dropped, but Claire never shivered. She didn't speak, but the air did. From the corners of the chapel came a sound not written in any book, not growling, not weeping, laughter. It started as a giggle, childlike, broken, then it grew, layered, voices upon voices, men, women, children, forgotten names flowing not out of joy, but out of recognition. "You want to cast me out," Claire finally said. "You should have tried before I remembered." Father Lucien pressed his relic against her heart, but the gold melted right there in his hand. No fire, just truth. Claire leaned forward, her voice a slow burn. "You thought I was possessed, but I'm not. I'm inhabited." Then the room shifted, paintings cried. The statue of Saint Michael cracked across the eyes, and the crucifix sagged and turned its face away. One of the priests dropped to his knees and began to pray, but the prayer caught in his throat like a swallowed thorn, and in the silence, Claire whispered, "You tried to bind the voice of memory, but memory doesn't obey holy water." The bishop tried to end the ritual, tried to command the voices to leave, but they didn't leave. They circled, they watched, they left, because they knew something the bishop didn't. They were never possessing Claire. She invited them because no one else would listen. That night, they released her, not because the exorcism worked, but because they were afraid of what else might answer next. Claire walked out of the chapel barefoot. The grass burned beneath her steps, but the flowers bloomed where she passed. And in her shadow, the wind whispered a name, not hers. Someone forgotten, someone remembered. Episode 7. The bells rang at midnight, but no one had touched them. There had been no midnight mass scheduled, no vigil, no wedding, no death, at least, not a new one. And yet, as the clock struck 12, the church bells above St. Elias began to toll. Not once, not twice, 13 times. The town woke in waves, dogs howled, windows rattled, and those who had lived long enough to remember the old rituals trembled, because long ago, 13 tolls meant one thing: a spirit had returned with unfinished judgment. Father Mateo stood at his window, drenched in sweat. He had dreamed of water, but woke to fire. The edges of his bed sheets were scorched but not burned, as if they had been touched by heat that didn't leave ash, only memory. Across the church square, Claire stood barefoot beneath the belfry. Her eyes never looked up. She didn't need to. She had not rung the bells. They had rung for her, or rather, for what walked behind her now. Figures began to appear at the edges of the fog, not alive, but not ghosts either. They weren't translucent. They weren't rotting. They were present, tangible in a way only unburied truth can be. And they stood beneath a window of the church. One figure for every story that had been silenced. Inside, the bishop locked the doors, but the locks didn't matter, because when bells tolled for judgment, walls are decoration, and the sanctuary began to shift. The paintings of saints blurred, the gold trim on the chalice peeled, the stained glass no longer told the story of salvation. Each showed a courtroom, Claire at the center, and behind her, every face the church had left behind. Suddenly, the main bell cracked, a sound so loud it made the cross above the altar tremble. Then came the voice, not from Claire, from the bell itself. You buried their voices in silence, but silence is a grave that never stays closed. The priests gathered in panic, praying, pleading, but their words were rejected. The prayer books turned to ash. The holy water boiled in its font, and Claire, still calm, whispered a single line. You thought forgetting would save you, but now memory tolls louder than your faith. Then the bell rang a 14th time, a toll that never existed in scripture, a sound for something older than sin, and every figure outside turned their heads to the church, not to ask for justice, to deliver it. Episode 8. The baptismal font filled itself, and it wasn't water. They found it at dawn. The baptismal font stone carved, cracked with H was brimming, but not with water, not with oil, with something thicker, red, viscous, ancient. It didn't drip, it didn't steam, it pulsed like a heart. Father Mateo was the first to approach. His hands trembled before he even reached the edge, and when he looked inside, he saw more than liquid. He saw faces, not reflections, but submerged mouths silently screaming beneath the surface. He staggered back, breath caught in his throat. This isn't blood, he whispered. Claire stood behind him, barefoot on the marble. No, she said, it's memory, liquidized. Baptism never erased sins. It only hid them where the light couldn't reach. The bishop demanded they drain it, but every time they tried, the pumps failed, the basins shattered. The liquid remained, still and watching. Then, one of the deacon's brother Elias dipped a finger in, not out of defiance, out of guilt, and when he touched it, the surface flouncy. For just a moment, a name appeared in the ice. Marcia. Ellis fell to his knees. He didn't cry, he confessed. I baptized her, but I knew what happened to her the week after. I knew, and I said nothing. The font began to ripple, not with rage, with recognition, as if saying, we remember her too. Suddenly, the room went still. The candles blew out. The font began to glow it with fire, but with buried truth. From the depths of the red came a voice, soft and childlike. You marked me holy, then let them unmake me in the dark. You said God would protect me, but you meant the walls would. Claire stepped closer, her voice low. The font was never meant to save, only to seal. But now it speaks, and it wants every name it once erased. Then, something rose from the liquid. Not a hand, not a body. A scroll, dripping, bound in flesh. And on it burned into the parchment were names. Hundreds, maybe thousands. All baptized, all forgotten, all left behind. Claire took the scroll. She did not read it. She only said, we do not need to read what heaven already mourns. And the font, satisfied, stilled, but the liquid remained, waiting, because more names were coming. Episode 9. The choir sang without mouths, and the hymn was a warning. They had rehearsed. There was no sheet music, no organist, no conductor, but when the congregation entered St. Elias this Sunday, the choir loft was already filled with voices, unseen, unstoppable, unnerving. The melody floated like incense, haunting, familiar, but twisted. It began soft, like a lullaby sung in a crypt, then grew, not louder, deeper. Each note dragged behind it a shadow. Each harmony cracked something ancient in the ear. And when the bishop turned his head upward, he saw them, silhouettes, figures where the choir once stood, but these had no mouths, only scars, sealed lips, gagged by memory, not flesh. Yet they sang, and the song was a warning. Claire stood at the back of the church. She didn't need to hear the words. She already knew them. This is the hymn of the unheard, she whispered. the song of the silenced, who were told their pain wasn't secret. The priest tried to drown the voices with the organ. He slammed his hands on the keys, but the pipes didn't produce music. They exhaled dust, centuries of forgotten ash, and the choir sang louder. The notes vibrated the walls, shook the chandeliers, peeled the gold leaf from the icons. Then, the lyrics finally formed, in Latin, but not the Latin of Rome, the Latin of condemnation. Sanctum non est, si celis celit. It is not holy if it hides crime. Cantus eorum factus est judicium. Their song has become judgment. Et lumen non venit de caelis, sed de memoria. And the light does not come from heaven, but from remembrance. The bishop collapsed, not from pain, from truth, because he recognized the tone. It was once a hymn sung at secret funerals for children the church never acknowledged. The melody had been forbidden, the records erased, but memory is not made of ink. It sings. Claire stepped into the aisle, her voice rising with theirs. You told them their silence would be rewarded, but heaven does not reward obedience to injustice. One of the figures in the loft pointed down, not with a hand, with light. It touched the pulpit, and a phrase carved itself in fire across the wood. Not on northeast note will be lost. The singing faded, the loft emptied, but the sound remained. In every brick, every pew, every whispered prayer that had once been used to cover screams. And from that moment on, no sermon was ever heard again without that melody beneath it. A quiet reminder that even in silence, some voices never stop singing. Episode 10. The relic wept well until it saw her face. It began quietly, just before dawn, when even the candles seemed hesitant to flicker. The statue of Saint Augustine, housed in the side chapel beneath its gold casing, wept, not tears. Oh, thick, amber, streaming from the carved stone eyes like sorrow had found a vessel to overflow. Pilgrims came, they knelt, they touched the well, they crossed themselves and whispered miracles. As sign, they said, that church is healing. But Claire stood at the doorway and didn't enter. She stared at the statue like one stares at a liar too ashamed to speak. Father Mateo approached her. You see the miracle, don't you? She didn't answer. She walked forward, step by slow step, until she was face to face with the relic. And then she whispered, tell them why you're crying. The well stopped. Right then, mid-drip, the air went still, heavy with the scent of crushed myrrh and old sins. Claire raised her hand. She didn't touch the statue, only hovered near its stone heart, and that's when the marble cracked. A single hairline fracture across the chest. Inside, something shimmered, not light, not gold, bone. The relic had been hollow, and hidden within it, a piece of rib, wrapped in red silk, marked with a child's initials. Father Mateo gasped, but this isn't from Saint Augustine. Claire turned, her voice like cold wind. Because this wasn't his relic, it was hers. The oil began to bubble, not from heat, from recognition. The statue's face twisted, its mouth split open in an unnatural smile, as if the stone itself was remembering something it had sworn never to speak. And then it began to scream, not aloud, but inside the minds of everyone present. A scream buried in centuries of veneration, a scream pressed into incense, a scream hidden behind sermons. I was never meant to be worshipped. It held. I was meant to warn. Claire placed the relic on the altar, not with reverence, but with justice. And as she did, the oil reversed, climbed back into the eyes, disappeared into the cracks, and the statue turned gray, empty, silent. It would never cry again, because the lie had been exhumed. And what weeps for truth never weeps twice. From that day forward, the pilgrims stopped coming. But the faithful who remained, they came not to pray, they came to listen. Episode 11. The stained glass broke only when she walked past it. There were 5 stained glass windows in St. Elias' nave. Each one told a story. The Annunciation, the Crucifixion, the Resurrection, the Descent of the Spirit, and the Triumph of the Church. Each window cast color onto the marble floor. Shadows of sanctity, frowned in glass, until Claire walked by. She wasn't running, she wasn't praying, she was just walking. But when her foot crossed the center aisle, just as the light hit her shoulder, the first wind of triumph of the church shattered. Not from force, not from wind, from recognition. The shards didn't fall like glass. They fell like feathers, soft, silent, sinful, because what they had depicted, priests in gold, saints in armor, souls kneeling, had never been truths. It was triumph built on silence. Claire paused, didn't flinch, didn't speak. She simply looked at the wall where the light used to land. Now it was bare. Father Lucien rushed in, hands shaking. This was blessed by Rome. He stammered, "It's been here since before I was born for anyone." Claire's gaze didn't move. "Then it's been lying to all of you longer than I thought." One by one, she passed the others. The descent of the Spirit cracked. The resurrection fractured down the center. The crucifixion splintered at the face of Christ. Only the Annunciation remained. Mary, the angel, the moment of sacred invitation. Claire stood before it, silent. The glass trembled, but didn't break. She reached out, touched it, and whispered, "You never lied." And from the broken windows behind her, a wind rose, not cold, not cruel, cleansing. It swept through the sanctuary, lifting the shards, spinning them in the air, and the light that passed through them no longer told stories of conquest or purity. It cast silhouettes of the forgotten, a girl clutching rosary beads in the dark, a boy kneeling alone in the confessional, a mother weeping beneath a locked chapel door. Stories that were never told in stained glass, until now. And on the floor beneath Claire, where the colored light pooled, a message appeared in shadow script. Let no story be sealed in silence again. The next day, the church covered the broken windows with cloth, but the people kept coming, not to see what remained, to remember what shattered. Episode 12. The confessional whispered to her, but it wasn't a priest inside. No one had used the old confessional in years, not since the whispers began. Some said it creaked on its own at night. Others claimed they heard weeping from behind the curtain. But no priest admitted it. No penitent dared enter it. Until Claire, she walked into the sanctuary at twilight. Not a service, not a prayer hour, just her, in the dark. The confessional Saturday in the far corner, cloaked in dust and dread. Its wood warped, its cross tilted, its curtain swaying. Though there was no wind, Claire didn't hesitate. She opened the door, stepped inside the left side, where sinners kneel. She knelt, not in reverence. In confrontation, a voice came from the other side. Not a priest's, a child's. "I was here first," it whispered, but no one listened to me. Claire didn't flinch. "I'm listening now," she said. Though it groaned, the booth shuddered like it remembered something too cruel for scripture. Then came another voice, older, familiar. "You confessed to me once, and I told you to forget it. I called it temptation, but I knew it was confession." The booth pulsed with memory, down scenes of voices, layered, stacked like bones in a crypt. "I told him my uncle touched me. I said I didn't feel clean. He told me to pray it away. He told me not to ruin a man's life. He told me I misunderstood. He told me to stay silent." Claire breathed slowly. She wasn't overwhelmed. She was documenting, letting them speak, letting them take back the truth that had been repackaged as shame. Then the confessional began to crack, not collapse. Open, the divider between sides fell away, and behind the curtain, there was no priest, only a mirror, but not a normal one. A dark mirror, liquid-like, shimmering, and it didn't show Claire. It showed every person who had ever entered that booth and walked out unheard. Claire stood and faced it. The whispers hushed, and she said, "I absolve nothing, but I acknowledge everything. You were not wrong. You were not weak. You were not forgotten." The mirror shattered, but no shards fell, only names. Hundreds, thousands, falling like feathers, soft and glowing. Claire gathered them in her hands, and as she walked out of the confessional, they followed her, not as ghosts, not as curses, as testimonies. Episode 13, final. Her judgment wasn't coming. It had already happened. They thought Judgment Day was a date on the calendar, a trumpet, a sky split in half, a parade of angels and fire. But it had already come, and it had thundered. It whispered through a girl, and every silence that followed her. Claire stood at the altar, not to preach, not to beg, to win something. The relics had stopped bleeding. The paintings no longer glowed. The statues had turned away from the pews like ashamed witnesses, and above her where the crucifix once hung, there was now only a blank beam. The congregation didn't sit, they stood, because somewhere deep inside, they knew this was not a sermon, this was a verdict. Claire raised the scroll she had carried since the baptismal font, the one bound in flesh, the one no one dared open until now. She unwrapped it slowly. The name shimmered still warm, still aching, and then they lifted, floated upward, like embers returning to the fire they were stolen from. Each name became a voice, each voice became a wind, each wind became a truth, and the church began to breathe, not with incense, with memory. The walls cracked, but no debris fell. The stained glass shimmered, but showed no saints, only faces, real ones, unpolished, uncanonized, the ones who never got justice, the ones who were always told to wait for heaven. Claire turned to them, to the church, to the ones still alive and the ones barely living, and she said, "You waited for heaven to open, but you forgot heaven listens, and it listened to them first." Suddenly, the altar pulsed, not with light, with a heartbeat, once, then again, then it stopped, because something ancient had ended. The pews shook, the candle flames spiraled, and the old bell tower, long silent, let out one final call. 14, the number never meant for Earth. Claire walked to the door. It opened before she touched it. Outside, the town was gathered, eyes wide, some with fear, some with hope. No one spoke until a child stepped forward, barefoot, mud-streaked, clutching a broken rosary. It looked up at Claire. "Are you her?" She kneeled. "No," she said. "I'm just the one who finally listened." And from behind her, the doors of St. Elias blew open, but not with wind, with light, a light that didn't blind, it revealed, and through it, the names rose, not into the sky, but into memory, where nothing sacred is ever truly lost again.